I thought before we got to the heavy reflections about von Hildebrand, we needed to lighten it up with some humor, you see. And so, now some of this I did a couple of years ago at a philosophy department meeting with the grad students, but some of it will be a little bit new. But I wanted to share with you the meaning of certain kinds of kisses, you see. So, for instance, the Parmenidean kiss, a kiss performed using techniques gained solely from theoretical speculation, untainted by any experiential data, by one who feels that the latter is irrelevant anyway. This is not mine, of course. This is on the internet, but in any case. The Hegelian kiss, dialectical technique in which the kiss incorporates its own antithekis, forming a synthekiss. The Wittgensteinian kiss. The important thing about this type of kiss is that it refers only to the symbol rather than the act itself. And as such, one must be careful not to make unwarranted generalizations about the act itself or the experiences thereof based merely on our manipulation of the symbology thereof. All right, a little too long. The Gordelian kiss, a kiss that takes an extraordinarily long time, yet leaves you unable to decide whether you've been kissed or not. The Socratic kiss, really a Platonic kiss, but it's claimed to be the Socratic technique, so it will sound more authoritative compared to the strictly Platonic kiss. Socratic kisses wander around a lot more and cover more ground. The Kantian kiss, a kiss that, eschewing inferior phenomenal contact, is performed entirely on the superior noumenal level. Though you don't actually feel it at all, you are nonetheless free to declare that it's the best kiss you've ever given or received. The Kafkaesque kiss, a kiss that starts out feeling like it's about to transform you but ends up just bugging you. The Sartrean kiss, a kiss that you worry yourself to death about even though it doesn't really matter anyway. The Kantian kiss, did I say that already? All right, where am I? Sartre, all right. The Pythagorean kiss, a kiss given by someone who's developed some new and wonderful techniques but refuses to use them on anyone for fear that others would find out about them and copy them. The Cartesian kiss, a particularly well-planned and coordinated movement. I think, therefore I aim. In general, a kiss does not count as Cartesian unless it is applied with enough force to remove all doubt that one has been kissed. Let's see. The Heisenbergian kiss. A hard-to-define kiss. The more it moves you, the less sure you are of where the kiss was. And finally, the most frustrating kiss of all, the kiss of Zeno. Your lips approach closer and closer, but they never actually get there. Now, beyond that, I wanted to share one of the funniest things I ever used to hear was when Jay Leno would do his headlines, all right? Real headlines out of newspapers. For instance, one of my favorite was, "For sale, parachute, used only once, never opened, slightly stained." There's a whole story there. But what I wanted to bring out was the way in which, despite the evident truth of basic logical and metaphysical laws, the principle of non-contradiction, the principle of identity, how easy it is for human beings to violate them. So here are a few headlines illustrating Human folly. Affordable housing too expensive. Senior luncheon will no longer include lunch. Owner denies lying, admits not telling the truth. Slowdown continues to accelerate. Highway 4 bypass, overpass, bypassed. We hate math, say 4 in 10, a majority of Americans. Tough anti-terrorism treaty would punish suicide bombers. Animal rights group to hold meeting at steakhouse. Man competent enough to be declared insane. Veterans of Civil War seeking new members. From a candidate for the school board, top half of students are well educated, bottom half get extra help. It's the middle half we're leaving out. Scientists warn infertility can be passed on. And with that, I leave you to the serious part of the program.
John Henry is a very strict taskmaster and has told me 10 minutes maximum. So I will try to stay within the 10 minutes. And I knew Hildebrand, Dietrich von Hildebrand, already when I was 3 years old.
Closer to the microphone.
You hear now? I knew Hildebrand already when I was 3 years old because, as I mentioned in the seminar, my mother had studied in Vienna and suddenly felt Latin and Greek and suddenly felt a strange voice that she should go to Munich. And she loved Vienna and didn't like particularly Munich and didn't want to go to Munich and was even a bit in love with her Latin professor. And so she had absolutely no intention. But this voice got so strong that she couldn't resist it anymore. And she went to Munich, and on the second day, she sat in one of the classes of Dietrich von Hildebrand, and that very much changed her life and changed my life as well. And so it was a very kind of mysterious but providential event. And then after Hildebrand fled from the Nazis, after he led the fight against the Nazis that now in this new book that John Henry has edited and published in the Legacy Project, Mein Kampf gegen Hitler, my fight against Hitler, he fled first to Austria, where he fought again against Hitler for almost for 8 or 9 years.
Almost 5 years.
What?
Almost 5 years.
Almost 5 years. He came only in 80. No, he was there before 34.
And he left in 38.
He left in 38. Yeah, well, 5 years. And he then was prosecuted. The Nazis wanted to kill him immediately after the annexion of Austria. And so he fled again, each time in great danger for his life. And so he went over Southern America to New York and then came back to Europe every year, but only from 1948 on. And that year I was 3 years old. And so my mother had studied before the war with him. And so he was friends with my family, with both my parents and many of their friends. And that way I got to know him as a child. And already as a child I had an extraordinary love for him. And all the children in the house, my cousins and my brother, of all the guests that came every summer to the house, we by far preferred Hildebrand because he was incredibly warm and full of humor and was a marvelous teller of jokes. I might conclude with one of his jokes that he liked to tell. So he had an extraordinary, I would say quite a unique personality. I've never in my life met anybody with that type of intensity of life and a very great warmth with which he particularly liked non-educated people. He always told me he prefers not to see professors because he always finds some errors and some and some abstruse ideas in them. But if he speaks to a cleaning lady or to a farmer or to a simple man on the street, that is a great joy for him. But stay away from these over-intellectual, screwed-up people. And when he spoke with them, he often got into quite an intense argument with them. Because he had another trait of his character, I think, was an incredible love for the truth. And that made him at times a little bit rough to speak with. If he was convinced that someone else committed an error. For example, one example was that my uncle, Gilbert Schuchter, who was living in the same house which my parents lived, and he was 10 years younger than my mother, and it was the beginning of the Nazi time, and my grandmother began to speak a little bit. Hildebrand was 100% against the Nazis from the first day on. Already in 1922 or 23, he was on the list of people to be executed by the Nazis. They had about 100 names they wanted to kill right away after the putsch. But the putsch failed in 1923. So when the people in Austria began to speak a little bit, be infected by Nazi ideas, many were quite infected, but my grandmother not very much, but a little bit said something positive about Hitler, and then he responded with such strength, how horrible this ideology is, and then she should never say such a thing, that my uncle, at that time a young boy, ran out very happy to his aunt and said, "Did you see how Gogo has niedergebügelt my mother? How he has ironed down my mother in this debate." So ironing down the opponent was maybe a certain consequence, in part disagreeable for the partners of this passionate love of the truth. But again, it rejoiced other people, and certainly it was a unique clarity he had, not only on the Nazi problems, but on many other problems in the crisis of the church in the 1960s. And he wrote this book, The Trojan Horse in the City of God. So he had quite a unique clarity of mind and a unique forcefulness of always looking for the truth and defending the truth, which was a great model for John and me and all those who were students of Hildebrand. He had also an extremely clear and distinct mind, so his lectures were extraordinarily clearly structured and very precise and extremely differentiated insights and distinctions, and it was really kind of feast to listen to such clear lectures. Many people loved him, especially these simple people, like the cleaning lady in the house of my mother, whom he always asked how she is, and radiated this kind of joyfulness. And she said to me once, "Oh, if we only could all be like this Professor Hildebrand." So he was quite a unique, kind of like a sunshine personality, and very strong personality. Most of the other people were more or less silent when he spoke, and he was very kind of not domineering, but very dominant personality in the debate. I, of course, had the occasion of meeting him in many personal meetings, like private seminars. We discussed together for quite a long time in Florence, in part in New York. The Trojan Horse in the City of God, also the Nature of Love book. I discussed with him many of the chapters. So it was a unique opportunity to have, so to speak, a great philosopher directly as my teacher and as my partner in the dialogue. And well, I could say innumerable other things about him and have innumerable memories about him, about his love of beauty, which was another extraordinary thing. And he loved the beauty of music, the beauty of Italy. He was born in Florence, and he had an extraordinary kind of almost being in love with the beauty of Italy, the beauty of the Toscana, the beauty, and he showed it to other people with full energy. And to me, when I was about 14, he played with me the late Beethoven quartets to introduce me to that sublime beauty of these quartets. And there is a funny story about us. So I was under the influence of Hildebrand listening, preferring much to listen to late Beethoven quartets than to dry the dishes in the kitchen, which my mother hoped for me. And so my mother sort of in desperation, and I said, it's much more beautiful to my mother to listen to this music than to dry the dishes. So she has much more value to do that. So she went to Hildebrand and said, talk to Joseph and tell him that it is more beautiful that he dries the dishes in the kitchen and obeys his mother than that he listens to this sublime music. And so Hildebrand said, well, we must distinguish there. Of course, if he obeys and dries the dishes and does his housework duties, that has a higher value, morally speaking, than listening to the late Beethoven quartets. So I was already quite disappointed of this response. But then he said, but the beauty of this highest form of beauty of music is a reflection of such a perfect moral goodness and sublimity that for Joseph to realize that in drying the dishes in the kitchen, he would have to be a saint. And, and from that point of view, this music is more beautiful than his drying the kitchen. So at any rate, that contains many aesthetic insights of Hildebrand, which I cannot here explain because the 10-minute limit of John Henry frightens me deeply. For that reason, I think, and I knew Hildebrand practically until his death, and still a few hours before he died, he called me in the most moving call and thanked God and me for everything. So it was a very deep, wonderful gift of such a deep friendship, such a deep relationship to him. He always called me his spiritual son, and that was another funny story because we were sometimes in Italy with my parents and him and his wife Lily on vacation. And so when he was asked about who I am, whether I am his son, he said, no, but he's my spiritual, mio figlio spirituale. And then he always laughed and laughed because he thought that the simple people to whom he said that I'm his spiritual son, would never understand that and would probably think I was his illegitimate child. which thought amused him very much. So at any rate, perhaps I should conclude with one of the many, especially Jewish jokes, which Hildebrand loved to tell. And he was a fantastic joke teller, like the whole society laughed when and he was a very good singer. He sang all kinds of arias, but also songs and Viennese songs. He loved Vienna very much. He felt it almost like his true home rather than Germany. And in a sense, even more than Italy, he felt very much at home in Austria. So at any rate, one of these jokes, which has a deep philosophical dimension, is the joke of two Jews who go to the restaurant, Abraham and Jacob. And so they order trout, and the waiter comes with a big plate, and on that plate is one huge trout and one tiny trout. And so Abraham says to Jacob, please serve yourself first. And Jacob says, glad to. And he takes the huge trout on his plate. And Abraham receives this tiny one. So Abraham says to Jacob, well, I'm happy that you have this big trout, but I just want to say that if one is in this situation and one is offered, two people are offered one very big and one very small meal, then the normal thing would be to choose the small one. So the other says, well, Jacob says to Abraham, well, which one would you have chosen? And Abraham says, of course, the small one. There you have it.
But let me maybe tell you one rather amusing story and then a more serious one regarding Dietrich von Hildebrand. The amusing one occurred back in '74 when Dietrich von Hildebrand and his wife Alice came to my mother's home in Mobile, Alabama, and Joseph Seifert and his wife, Michael Healy, still unmarried, joined us, and we had a kind of week-long symposium there discussing issues of philosophy from morning till night. A memorable, memorable week that we spent together, and I certainly remember von Hildebrand as singer. We always knew when he was up in the morning, when the halls were full of Italian songs that were otherwise never heard in the house. But we, in the afternoon, would walk with my mother, and we walked through the neighborhood, and you have to know my mother was a realtor at the time, worked for a realty company, and so we would walk past houses, and some of them had a sign for sale, and a realtor was named. And von Hildebrand asked my mother, "Is that your realty company?" And she says, "No, that's a competitor." And he you see, he had this enormous loyalty toward his friends. When he heard that the sign was a sign of a competitor, he walked up to it, turned the sign around so that it couldn't be seen from the road, and in that way tried to lend support to my mother and her work. But it was playful and humorous, but at the same time, this loyalty to his friends, taking their side, that was really expressed in that unforgettable a bit of mischief that we experienced with him. What, though, maybe is even more revealing about this great man is the first encounter I had with him. I was an undergraduate at Georgetown University. I had put his name in for a kind of distinguished lecture series, and it was accepted, and I had known a little bit of his work and knew of his reputation as a philosopher, and I was delegated to provide the hospitality. I went and picked him up at the Washington National Airport when he arrived. That was quite a dramatic event because we couldn't find each other at the airport, and Alice von Hildebrand was calling back to Georgetown University, "We're going back to New York if you don't come and pick us up." And so it was just some higher power or lower, darker power did not want us to meet that night, but I eventually discovered that there were multiple newsstands of the same name, and he was waiting at one and I was looking for him at another. But we eventually met and had a wonderful first evening together. But then he came to Georgetown to give a lecture entitled The True Meaning of Aggiornamento. So this was in 1966, and the council was just over by a few years. And the lecture he gave was really a kind of first draft of that book of his, The Trojan Horse in the City of God, that Joseph just mentioned. And it was a lecture in which he spoke about the church and the world, and the danger of the church being taken over by the world and disfigured. And he wanted to plead for the supernatural beauty of the church against all, you might say, accommodating tendencies of the time. And as I listened to that lecture, I was overwhelmed by the sense that this was not just another eminent thinker. I had heard a lot of those at Georgetown, but there was something different from rich, significant thought. There was here, and I had never really experienced the like of that, there was here a witness, a Christian witness, speaking out of a religious passion, unlike anything I had experienced before. It was, I thought to myself, not just another learned professor, but a kind of confessor. As I say, a real ardent witness. And it was a dramatic moment for me. It's as if a new world of religion and faith and the supernatural broke through for me in that encounter with von Hildebrand, especially that contrast between the merely intellectually able, and of course von Hildebrand was immensely intellectually able, but the contrast between that and the man of faith who bears witness with this unconditional commitment. And that was one of those moments that marked me and, as it were, gave a whole new direction to my life. And so that first meeting and that lecture that I heard that night is indelibly with me still, and that was the beginning of my friendship with von Hildebrand. I might just mention one other thing as we got to know each other, so he urged me to go do my doctoral studies at the University of Salzburg, where there was a center of the realist phenomenology that he represented, and I did follow that advice. And there I was as a helpless American, not speaking much German, in Salzburg, getting ready for my studies in the fall. And he and his wife came to town. They were on their way to Vienna, and they said, "You come with us to Vienna." And I never forget the kind of overwhelming kindness he showed me. He took me to places that were significant in his life. He showed me the place where the Austrian Chancellor Dollfuss was assassinated, with whom he had worked so closely, and told me that story. And he said, "Now there's this count, an old friend of mine, you must meet him or her. And there's this painting in a church, you've got to see it." And I thought to myself, what is this? I'm this insignificant, innocent, or at least helpless American student, and what claim do I have on this attention? And so that disproportion, you might say, between my sense of my own significance and this being inundated with the kindness and attention of von Hildebrand, that was, you might say, an experience, a personalist experience of being received in friendship that was also something new for me. So that, let me just share that with you from the beginning of my friendship with him, and I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
I thought also already before John Crosby said these inspiring words, which also correspond deeply to my own manifold experience. But I wanted to say one thing that I have not said, and that is that Hildebrand's profound faith, he was a convert to Catholicism. His parents were quite liberal Protestants, almost pantheists, and his father was a famous artist, and they had a wonderful house in Florence, and he was rather wealthy, but had no Christian faith. And Hildebrand already, when he was 3 years old, that I think I mentioned already in the seminar, had this deep faith. And when his older sisters, whom he admired and who were wonderful personalities, then they all together with their parents said at the table that it's a ridiculous idea that Jesus would be God, but he was a wonderful, extraordinary man. And so one can understand why the Christians follow him. Then he stood up, a 3-year-old boy, in his bed and told his sisters, "And I swear to you that Jesus is God." And he still didn't know where he got this faith from, perhaps from a nunna, and from reading biblical stories. But at any rate, it was extraordinary for such a small boy to resist the family he so much admired and he so much were models for him. And this faith, which he then, of course, in his conversion when he was about 24 years old, and converted profoundly, and retired from his academic work in order to write this wonderful book, Transformation in Christ, to express that completely new light of Christ and the Christian revelation, and interpreted the Sermon on the Mount beautifully. I recommend to all read this book, The Transformation in Christ, which also for my faith became a crucial element. And what John Crosby said, this extraordinary witness for the faith and this intense conviction of that uninventable beauty and glory of Christ and of his message and of the supernatural virtues and of the saints permeated him so much that it left on many people a deep impression. There were over 100 godchildren he had who converted to Catholicism because of his lectures, because of his example, because of his faith. So he had quite a big radiance among many people. And one aspect of all this was that linked to what you have read about the heart and Hildebrand's discovery and insistence on this third spiritual center of acts, the human heart, these affections which are not less spiritual than the acts of the will, of the intellect, that he very much incorporated himself. I've never seen, I think, a person more intensely, affectively responding to other persons or to the world or to events. And one aspect of this I would like to mention, because it moved me very deeply. I've never seen a person who was so much in love with the church. Like when he felt that after the Second Vatican Council, the confusion in the church was so big and the heresies abounding and much destroyed in the church, he often cried in my presence, and it was for him not at all like something he only regretted, but really it was like a lover who weeps over the hurting of his bride. And so he had this extraordinary, profound, affective response and deep love of the church, which also I've hardly, if ever, seen in any other person, this type of going to his depths of his heart, whatever good or bad thing happened in the church. So with this I want to conclude, because I see now he nods, but maybe in a minute he will shake his head.
I wanted to add a story or two along those lines. I was a student at Loyola of Los Angeles from 68 to 72, and I got interested in von Hildebrand's philosophy in the fall of 70 through Ron de Chervin. And von Hildebrand then came to give a talk, but it turned out his heart was too weak, and they decided he couldn't stand the excitement. So Alice gave the talk instead on how Kierkegaard dealt with the theological liberals of his day, with many parallels 100 years later within the Catholic Church. But in the question and answer, well, actually, it's interesting to note that year the Jesuits had Hans Kung come, and they rolled out the red carpet, kissed his feet, treated him like he was nearly God, and he acted that way too. No, he was, I'm afraid, he simply conveyed, I was I considered myself scum at the time in my life. I mean, I didn't have a very good self-image at the time. I didn't trust my own judgments, but Hans Kung struck me, I'm afraid, as one of the most arrogant people I'd ever met, and I was repulsed by him. But in any case, when von Hildebrand came, the Jesuits did exactly the opposite. They discouraged anybody from going to his talk, didn't want it publicized, called a house meeting so that all their young Jesuit scholastics would not be able to go to his talk, etc. But Alice gave the talk, and then in the question and answer period, something came up about the church, and I was in the same row with von Hildebrand. I was, a bit away, but in the same row. And Alice started to answer, but then Dietrich couldn't contain himself about the church, and he stood up, and he just was, even though with his weak heart, he was just filled with this life and love. And he used language I hadn't heard since grade school about the Holy Roman Catholic Church and his love for it. And he had this umbrella, and he was swinging it around, nearly took people's heads off, and he was just lost in his love for the church. And I thought, looking down the row, he's going to die right here. But he won't care. Now, then a couple of years later, I went to Salzburg in the fall of, I guess, 72. But by that time, Dr. Seifert and Dr. Crosby had gone to Dallas. I followed them there later and studied with them for several years. But while I was there in the fall of 72, Dietrich was there too, but got very sick with his heart, was in the hospital, and so I went to visit him. And the nurses said, well, why don't you take a walk with him up the hallway? That would help him, you see. So he's got, intravenous fluids and a thing to hang on to. Or we're walking up and down the hallway, and we get into a philosophic conversation about truth and values. And he starts getting animated and filled with life. And I think, he's going to die right here, and I'm going to be blamed. What did you do to the man? See, but he didn't. He lived, you see. So, but again, that incredible life, when it came to truth and beauty and value and the church and persons, he just shone. And it just carried over to everybody he met. So, all right.
I don't have any stories about Dietrich von Hildebrand or about Karol Wojtyła, neither of them directly. Anyways, but what I would like to do is to offer a toast and commence a series of toasts for you all. So, my friends, and I can call you my friends now at the end of this week. A week ago, you were strangers, applicants, colleagues, perhaps. But after a week of this seminar, I think that we can all call each other friends. I think that's a particularly special thing about these seminars. It's something that Rocco talked about last night when he was talking about his time with the Holy Father, is that he facilitated an environment in which people became friends. He made friends of people. It's something that I hope that we do here, a part of the spirit of Karol Wojtyła that we keep alive in our Hildebrand summer seminars. And I dare say that we have. As I've been interviewing a lot of you over the last few days and asking you what has been your favorite part of the seminar, what has been the most special part of the seminar, what has been most important to you. Every single one of you has said, in some form or other, the people, the friendships, the conviviality, the relationships that I have made. And so I think that we have succeeded in doing that. And it reminds me of another thing that Rocco said in his talks yesterday, was that personalism is not just a set of ideas, a body of ideas. More than that, it's a method. It's a way of treating people. It's a way of being with people. He spoke of the person is being. That's something, again, that we try to live out here. And I think, based on your reactions, that we have done so. But we didn't do so. We facilitated it. You all have done so. You all have made great relationships, great friendships that will endure beyond this seminar. And that's something that you all have brought to this, that we have merely facilitated. So I would like to give this first cheers to you all. Thank you.
Though alcohol is the form of courage most often associated with college, I was fortunate to discover something else there. Growing up, I was painfully shy, but it was through the personalism in the form of von Hildebrand, Wojtyła, and in a special way, Crosby, that I discovered the key to a successful social life. This one is free. I'll charge for the next one. Any social interaction becomes infinitely easier when you focus on the other. In opening my eyes to the wonder of the thou, to the other as subject, unscripted conversation was transformed from a moment of terror to an opportunity and an adventure. An opportunity to put the other at ease, and an adventure to interact with possible gods and goddesses, to steal C.S. Lewis's phrase from The Weight of Glory. Now, I'm not sure helping an awkward girl make her way on campus was Dr. Crosby's intention in writing The Selfhood of the Human Person, but I thank him for it nonetheless. And from an older and more mature perspective, but in the same spirit of gratitude, I offer a heartfelt thank you to the Hildebrand Institute, or the Hildebrand Project, in a special way to the professors that are here this week, for their work to expand, clarify, refine, and propagate a true philosophy of the person. So, cheers.
Cheers.
So I, along with Mary, was asked about 15 minutes before dinner began this evening if I would be willing to deliver a toast. And so I deferred at first, but after having another glass of wine, I decided that, being the irreducible and unrepeatable person that I am, if this turns out to be unsatisfactory, at the very least, I'll be able to claim that it's a unique expression of my inner self-presence. So I look around and I see what is one of the finest expressions of what personalism has come to mean for me over the course of the past few days. A convivial sharing, a luxuriating in one another's presence, enjoying laughter and cheer, and scintillating, stimulating conversation and fellowship and friendship. It's been a week of extraordinary learning and sharing for me. And I mean, just this evening I learned that you can put Coke into red wine. Who knew? This is a gift of our Spanish personalist contingent to enrich my personhood. In all seriousness, though, that joyful mutual presence has been the great gift of this week to me. It's rejuvenated me, it's restored me, it's recentered me in a very fundamental way. It's given me an intellectual communion that I've been missing in some fundamental way, even though I'm in academia. And it's been an intellectual communion with like-minded persons, not individuals, mind you, but persons. And the bourbon didn't hurt either. Being, of course, a representative of objective aesthetic value in our fallen world. But being a poetry person, being a literature person, I thought I might dare this evening to offer a small bit of poetry that represents for me the deep spirit of personalism. And in these situations, I tend to prefer to rely on the wise words of others rather than depend upon myself, self-present though I may be. So you'll forgive me for using a mediating, depersonalizing device to summon forth these words, because I fear my memory is not as reliable as it might otherwise be when I'm put on the spot like this. So the poem is Gerard Manley Hopkins' As Kingfishers Catch Fire, one of my very favorite poems from one of my very favorite poets, and I will try to do it justice. Again, I fear my recitation may not be up to Hopkins standards. As kingfishers catch fire. As kingfishers catch fire, dragonflies draw flame. As tumbled over rim in roundy wells, stones ring. Like each tucked string tells, each hung bell's bow swung, finds tongue to fling out broad its name. Each mortal thing does one thing and the same, deals out that being, indoors each one dwells, selves, goes itself, myself it speaks and spells, crying, what I do is me, for that I came. I say more, the just man justices, keeps grace, that keeps all his goings graces, acts in God's eyes what in God's eyes he is, Christ. For Christ plays in 10,000 places, lovely in limbs and lovely in eyes, not his, to the Father through the features of men's faces. And so now, if you'll raise your glasses to the friendship of the past few days, to our fellowship, and to our communio personarum, you're here.